On some mornings in history, the world wakes up knowing nothing will ever be the same again. There are days when old beliefs fall apart, when proud ideas collapse, and when the sound of a single moment travels farther than any message written on paper. The day the 240mm howitzers arrived on the battlefield was one of those days. It was a day when silence was replaced by a deep thunder. A day when Germany's strongest fortresses, built with pride and complete confidence, finally met a force they could not stop. At first light, the sky was cold and still. Thin mist floated above the hills, covering the concrete shapes that had guarded Germany's borders for years. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from old gun pits. Everything felt quiet, almost peaceful, like the pause before a storm. Soldiers on both sides breathed in the heavy air, feeling that something was coming, something larger than anything they had faced before. Far behind the lines, the ground shook gently. It was a slow, distant tremble, like the earth clearing its throat before speaking out loud. Birds lifted into the sky, startled. Dry leaves drifted across the road as if pushed by invisible hands. And then came the sound, deep, rolling, powerful. The kind of sound that does not just fill the ears but moves through the chest, down the spine, and into the soil. It was the sound of the American 240mm howitzers being pulled into position. These guns were not ordinary weapons. They were giants made of steel, each one heavier than a small building. When they moved, trees shook. When they stopped, the earth settled under their weight. And when they fired, even the bravest soldiers felt something tighten in their chest. Germany's fortress lines had been designed to survive anything: shells, bombs, storms, assaults. They had survived the last war. They had survived years of planning, shaping, and testing. They were carved into rock, built with thick concrete, filled with tunnels and iron doors. Many German soldiers believed nothing in the world could break them. But that belief was about to be tested. As the American crews reached the firing ground, they worked in calm silence. Their breath formed white clouds in the cold air. Their hands were red from metal and rope. They knew the enemy was watching from far-off bunkers, but they did not rush. Every movement was practiced. Every step had been repeated 100 times before. They set the gun platforms. They aligned the barrels. They calculated the distance to the first fortress, checking and checking again. The air smelled of oil, metal, and the sharp scent of broken grass where the machines had rolled through. Nearby, officers raised binoculars, studying the distant outline of the German fortress. Its walls looked thick and proud, like a stone beast resting on the hillside. The concrete was dark from rain, and narrow slits for machine guns stared like angry eyes watching the American positions. Perhaps the Germans inside felt safe. Perhaps they trusted their walls. Perhaps they whispered to each other that no shell could reach them, no blast could shake them, no enemy gun was powerful enough to hit them directly. They had never met the 240mm. When the order finally came, the American gunners stood ready. For a moment, everything became still again. Even the wind paused. Even the birds seemed silent. The men touched the cold steel of the shell, guiding it into the chamber. The shell was enormous, almost as big as a man's torso. It felt heavy with potential, as if it already knew what it would soon become. The firing cord was pulled. And the world changed. The explosion was not just loud. It was overwhelming. A burst of white fire flashed from the barrel. A long, heavy shockwave moved across the field, pushing against chests and clothes and loose stones. The ground jumped under the soldiers' boots. The smell of burnt powder rushed into the air, sharp and metallic. Far away, the shell screamed through the sky. It cut through the wind, tearing its way toward the German fortress. Soldiers inside the bunker heard the noise, a rising whistle, terrible and fast, just moments before impact. Then the shell hit. The fortress did not shatter all at once. It shook. A deep crack echoed through its walls. Dust fell from ceilings. Lights flickered. Tools rattled on metal racks. Some soldiers dropped to their knees. Others pressed against the walls, feeling the vibration travel through stone and bone. And then came the blast wave, a force that rolled through every hallway, every room, every sealed chamber like a fist made of air. Above ground, pieces of concrete were thrown into the sky. Smoke and soil shot upward, forming a rising cloud. The bunker's proud shape changed suddenly, as though a giant had struck it with one heavy blow. Inside the American lines, the gunners watched the distant fortress slowly fade into a cloud of dust. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They simply prepared the next shell. Another order came. Another pull of the cord. Another explosion. Second after second, minute after minute, the sky filled with the roar of the guns. Each shell traveled farther and struck harder than anything the Germans had expected. The walls that once felt unbreakable trembled with every impact. Cracks widened. Metal doors bent. Floors shifted under the shaking earth. Some soldiers inside the fortress tried to run. Others stayed frozen, covering their ears, waiting for the next shell. A few officers shouted orders, trying to bring calm, but the fortress no longer listened. It was no longer the fortress they knew. Outside, dust rolled down its sides like water. The bunker's edges sagged. Small pieces of concrete fell like fragments of old armor chipping away. With every hit, the German soldiers felt something deeper than fear. They felt disbelief. The 240mm howitzers had not just damaged their walls. They had broken their confidence. For years, the fortresses had been symbols of German strength. Now they were shaking under the thunder of a weapon built by distant hands, brought from far across the ocean, dragged slowly across broken roads to this one moment. And as more shells flew, the truth became clearer. The age of fortress warfare was ending. Perhaps this was how the old world collapses, not with silence but with thunder. Not with a slow decay, but in a single morning when something stronger finally arrives. And yet, this was only the beginning. What followed was not just destruction, but a change in the very meaning of war itself. As the dust rose, as the guns thundered, as the fortresses cracked open, a new chapter began, shaped by courage, fear, innovation, and the power of human decision. And the world would never be the same again. Before the 240mm howitzers fired their first shells, before the thunder and shaking earth, there was the world in which these fortresses lived. A world shaped by fear, pride, and the heavy shadow of war. To understand why this day mattered so much, we must travel back to the landscapes, the cities, and the minds that built these defenses. We must step inside the world that believed itself unbreakable. Germany's strongest fortresses were not merely buildings. They were statements. They were symbols of strength, of order, of a belief that human hands could shape walls strong enough to stop the future from arriving. Cold gray concrete rose from the ground like frozen waves, stretching across miles of hills and valleys. Some fortresses sat half-buried underground, hidden behind layers of earth and steel. Others stood boldly on ridgelines, watching everything like old stone guardians. If you stood near one of these fortresses before the war reached them, you would feel the cold air settle on your skin. The wind was sharper near the concrete, as if the walls pushed the weather aside. You could smell metal, oil, damp earth, and the faint scent of old gunpowder that never fully went away. On quiet mornings, dew gathered along the edges of rusted steel doors and narrow firing slits. Birds often perched on the rooftop rails, unaware that below them lay giant chambers with thick cables, ammunition rooms, and long tunnels filled with echoes. Each fortress had its own personality. Some were dark and narrow, with long passages that felt like caves carved by machines. Others were wide and open, with heavy iron doors tall enough to swallow trucks. Many of the bunkers had layers, an outer shell, an inner shell, and secret escape tunnels that ran beneath forests and fields. These places were not built to be beautiful. They were built to survive. Every brick, every bolt, every inch of concrete had a purpose. German engineers who designed these structures believed they were building something that could outlast any storm. They measured, tested, and calculated. They built thicker walls than any fortress before them. They used steel bars so strong they had to heat them with fire to bend them into place. They poured concrete through day and night. Their blueprints were detailed with numbers, angles, and shock absorption patterns. They studied the failures of old forts from past wars and promised that this time, they would not repeat mistakes. To the German commanders who inspected the finished fortresses, these structures felt like the bones of an ancient creature made of stone. Powerful, silent, eternal. But a fortress is more than just walls. It is also the people who live inside it. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The walls held a chill that never fully left. The lights glowed a dull yellow, flickering slightly when the generators struggled. The floors were hard and smooth. Boots echoed down the hallways. If you listened carefully, you could hear water dripping somewhere far away. You could hear the low hum of machines. You could hear voices bouncing off the concrete as soldiers joked, argued, or tried to hide their fear. Life inside a fortress followed a rhythm of routine. Soldiers cleaned their rifles. Officers checked maps. Engineers inspected the ventilation shafts. Cooks prepared simple meals that tasted mostly of salt and boiled vegetables. At night, some soldiers wrote letters to families they hadn't seen in years. Others stared at the ceiling, listening to the humming machines and wondering if the war outside would ever reach them. Many soldiers trusted the fortress walls. They believed the concrete would protect them. They believed the bunkers were stronger than any weapon. Some even joked that they could sleep through a bombardment. Those jokes would not last forever. Beyond the German lines, across rivers and forests, the American forces marched through landscapes that seemed endless. Their boots sank into soft mud. Their trucks rattled along broken roads. Their breath mixed with smoke rising from ruined villages. War had burned fields and left skeletons of trees behind. Wooden fences lay broken. Homes stood empty. Everything was touched by a feeling that the world had been waiting too long in silence. In some areas, the air smelled of wet soil mixed with the bitter odor of burned metal. In others, the scent of pine trees mixed with the smell of cold river water. Snow clung to branches like thin white fingers. The wind carried whispers through the forests, brushing against helmets and uniforms. American soldiers often looked at the distant German hills and wondered where the fortresses were hiding. They knew they were out there, somewhere behind the mist, somewhere behind the tree lines. They heard stories of walls too thick to break, guns too deep to reach, tunnels too long to block. Some believed these stories. Others thought they were exaggerated. But all of them felt a quiet pressure in their chest. They knew that sooner or later they would face those fortresses. Then came the sight of the 240mm howitzers being moved into position. For many soldiers, it was the first time they saw such a powerful weapon up close. The gun stood taller than a man, its barrel long and heavy, its wheels wide and strong enough to hold its massive weight. The steel felt cold even under sunlight. The machinery groaned as it was positioned, like a sleeping animal waking from a long rest. Some soldiers touched the barrel gently, running a hand along the smooth metal. Others stared, unable to look away, imagining the force that would soon burst from it. They smelled oil and grease. They heard the clanking of chains and the grinding of metal as the gun was aligned. Dust rose around their boots as crews shouted instructions to each other. Every movement felt heavy with meaning. In the distance, the German fortresses waited silently. Between the two sides lay a land full of scars. Craters pitted the fields like giant footprints. Burned-out tanks rested like wounded animals. Abandoned trenches stretched across the ground, filled with water reflecting the gray sky. Broken fences and shattered trees stood like reminders of battles long past. The wind carried the sounds of distant artillery far across the fields. Sometimes you could hear the faint murmur of engines. Other times only the whisper of grass. This landscape had seen war many times before. But the day the 240mm howitzers arrived, the land was about to witness something new, a kind of power that even it had not learned to absorb quietly. And yet, before the first shell was fired, there was still a tension in the air, a thin wire stretched tight between two worlds. The German fortresses, confident and still. The American artillery, patient and ready. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The men on both sides sensed that they were standing in a moment of history. They might not have known exactly how the day would unfold, but they felt the weight of it. They felt the wind change. They felt something deep in their bones, like the earth was preparing for a sound so loud it would echo through time. Perhaps that is why everything felt strangely calm in those final moments before the guns fired. The calm before a storm that no wall had been designed to survive. The calm before Germany's proudest fortresses met the force that would shatter their legend forever. And as the mist lifted and the sun rose higher in the pale morning sky, both sides stared across the land toward each other, unaware that this day would not simply be another moment in the war. It would be the day the old world of fortress warfare finally ended. It would be the day thunder arrived in the form of steel. To understand why the 240mm howitzers changed everything, we must go deeper into the history behind them. History is not only made of moments, it is made of reasons. And the story of these giant guns begins long before they were rolled onto the battlefield. It begins with lessons learned from earlier wars, from broken promises, and from ideas that refused to stay in the past. For many years, military planners believed that strong walls could protect nations. They looked back at ancient castles, stone towers, and mountain forts that had survived countless attacks. They studied the forts of old Europe, built with thick granite and hidden chambers. These places had often stopped invading armies for months, sometimes even years. This history inspired Germany to build powerful fortresses in the early 1900s. They placed them along key borders. They dug deep tunnels beneath the fields. They created bunkers that seemed impossible to destroy. Some were designed to survive direct artillery hits. Others were hidden under forests, blending into the landscape. Germany believed that if they built these fortresses strong enough, they could control the future of any war. They believed that walls could stop tanks, soldiers, and even fear itself. But war was changing. In the First World War, huge guns had already shown that even the strongest walls could crack. Massive cannons like Big Bertha shocked Europe by destroying older fortresses. These huge weapons fired shells so heavy that the ground shook for miles. When they hit, entire walls fell. The world saw that technology could defeat stone. Still, after that war, many nations returned to building defenses. Old habits stayed alive. They believed that with better concrete, better steel, and better engineering, they could create fortresses that nothing could destroy. Germany especially believed in this idea. Their engineers created bunkers with walls up to several meters thick. They placed armored turrets on top, built underground barracks, and installed weapons that could fire at enemies long before they came close. The fortresses were not just protective, they were offensive too. They could fire artillery from deep inside their walls, shielded from enemy guns. On maps, these strongpoints looked like teeth, sharp, dangerous, ready to bite. They formed defensive lines that curved across valleys and hills, each one covering the other. If one bunker was attacked, another could fire in its support. But there was a hidden weakness. A weakness the Germans did not fully understand. They believed the strongest walls were their greatest strength. But in reality, the walls were only strong against the old kinds of guns. They were not built to face a new generation of weapons. Guns larger, heavier, and far more destructive than anything the world had seen before. Across the ocean, American engineers were studying the same lessons. They watched how modern wars were fought. They learned that mobility mattered, but so did raw power. They understood that some targets were too strong for normal artillery. They knew that if war ever came again, armies would need weapons powerful enough to break the toughest enemy defenses. And so, years before the 240mm howitzers rolled into Europe, American designers began working on something special. Something heavy. Something built not to destroy fields or soldiers, but to crush concrete, steel, and stone. A weapon meant to break the backbone of an army. The 240mm howitzer was one of the largest field artillery pieces ever created by the United States. It fired shells that weighed as much as small cars. These shells were built to penetrate deep into concrete before exploding. When they detonated, the shock waves traveled through the walls, shaking them from the inside out. Engineers tested the gun again and again. They tested it against thick slabs of concrete. They studied the cracks. They measured the force of the explosion. They calculated how deep the shell would go before bursting. They learned how the shockwaves moved through stone. They kept improving the weapon until it became something unmatched. It was not a fast weapon. It could not fire many shells in a short time. It was heavy, slow to move, difficult to position. But once it fired, it could do what nearly no other gun could do. It could break a fortress. The American military did not plan to use it everywhere. It was too large for regular battles. But for situations where the enemy believed they were safe, deep inside bunkers, behind walls, under steel plates, the 240mm was exactly the tool they needed. When American troops crossed Europe during the war, they faced many German bunkers. At first, smaller weapons were used. Tanks fired shells. Infantry used explosives. Aircraft dropped bombs. But some fortresses continued to stand. They absorbed the hits and stayed alive. Soldiers trying to attack them grew frustrated. They took casualties. They realized that some fortresses would require something far more powerful. So the 240mm howitzers were called forward. There were only a few of these guns, and moving them was a slow and difficult job. Roads had to be cleared. Bridges had to be checked so they wouldn't collapse under the weight. Sometimes entire crews took hours just to move the gun a few hundred yards. But when the howitzers finally reached the battlefield, the effect was immediate. Their presence changed the mood of every soldier around them. Some felt hope. Finally, they had a weapon strong enough to break the German defenses. Others felt fear. If this gun fired at them, there would be nowhere to hide. The Germans, too, began to hear stories about these giant American guns. They learned that bunkers destroyed miles away had not fallen from bombs, but from artillery. They learned that walls once believed unbreakable were now cracked open by shells they had never imagined. Inside German HQs, officers looked at maps and wondered which fortresses were next. Engineers who once bragged about their work began to worry. They studied the damage reports and realized something important. The 240mm howitzers delivered more force than their fortresses were built to withstand. Not just more force. Far more. They had underestimated the future. They had underestimated the speed at which weapon technology could grow. They had underestimated the determination of enemy engineers who refused to accept that anything was impossible to destroy. The American howitzers were not only weapons, they were lessons. They showed the world that even the strongest structures have limits. They showed that no matter how thick the walls, innovation could shatter them. And they showed that war was moving into a new age, where power was measured not by stone and steel, but by the creativity of the minds building the machines. The day the howitzers fired on Germany's strongest fortresses, they exposed all these truths at once. They revealed that the old ways of war, fortress lines, permanent defenses, underground cities of concrete, were reaching their final chapter. And yet, there is one more reason this weapon mattered so much. It wasn't just the engineering. It was the psychology. When a soldier inside a fortress hears small artillery, they stay calm. They know the walls will protect them. When they hear aircraft dropping bombs, they brace themselves, but they trust the thick concrete above their head. But when they hear a weapon powerful enough to shake the earth, something changes. A fortress is only strong when the people inside it believe it is strong. On the day of the bombardment, that belief cracked long before the walls did. One German soldier later wrote that it felt as if giants were hitting the world with invisible hammers. Another said the walls seemed to breathe and move like they were alive. Many described dust filling their lungs, lights flickering, and the floor shifting under their feet. For years they had believed their fortresses were safe. But in those moments they realized safety had been an illusion. And illusions cannot protect anyone. On the American side, officers studied the results. They saw how the shells hit. They measured the cracks. They inspected the damage. They understood that they were living through a moment that would change military history. They were watching the end of an era. They were watching the fall of fortress warfare. It is important to remember something here. Fortresses had been part of human defense for thousands of years. Castles, walls, strongholds, they protected empires, kings, and nations. They shaped borders. They shaped wars. They shaped history itself. But on this day, with the thunder of the 240mm howitzers rolling across the hills, those old traditions were broken. The future had arrived in the form of steel, fire, and innovation. This day was not only about destruction. It was about discovery, the discovery that walls are not enough. That power alone cannot guarantee safety. That technology always finds a way to challenge old ideas. And as dust rose from the broken fortresses, drifting into the cold air, the world silently learned that no defense is eternal. Not even the strongest fortress. Not even the thickest concrete. Not even the most trusted belief. This was the moment the world saw that the future of war would not be written by stone, but by minds willing to imagine forces greater than anything before them. The 240mm howitzer was one of those forces. And its arrival marked the beginning of a new story, one shaped by courage, struggle, fear, and the human need to create something powerful enough to shape history. As we move deeper into this story, take a moment to imagine something simple. Imagine you are standing on that battlefield. Not as a historian, not as a viewer, but as someone who can feel everything around you. The cold morning air touches your face. The ground under your boots is soft from last night's rain. Far away, a gray fortress sits like a sleeping giant. And behind you, a 240mm howitzer waits in silence, its steel body colder than the wind. Now close your eyes for a moment, just in your mind, and listen. Can you hear the distant echoes of tools hitting metal as the gun crew prepares the giant weapon? Can you hear soldiers whispering, trying to stay calm as they wait for the order? Can you hear the quiet crackle of burning grass where old shells once landed? Maybe you also hear something deeper, the heartbeat of a land that has seen too many battles, the breath of men who do not know if they will see the next sunrise, the quiet trembling of a fortress that has never been tested like this before. Now picture the first shell being lifted by the American crew. You can see their hands gripping the cold surface of the huge steel projectile. You can feel its weight, heavy, solid, dangerous. You can almost smell the mix of oil and gunpowder. Imagine that moment when the shell slides into the chamber. A deep sound as metal touches metal. A final check. A slow breath. And then the command. The firing cord is pulled. The blast hits you like a wave of air. Your ears ring. Your chest tightens. Your feet feel the ground shake. You watch the shell disappear into the sky like a comet of steel, leaving a trail of sound behind it. And then, after a few seconds that feel like minutes, it hits the fortress. A flash. A shock. A sound so powerful that it rolls across the land like thunder. Dust rises. Concrete cracks. The air changes. Now ask yourself a simple question. What would you think in that moment? Would you feel fear? Would you feel power? Would you feel the end of something old? Or the beginning of something new? This story is not only about weapons and walls. It is also about what people felt, on both sides, when the world they knew suddenly changed forever. And now we will step into their lives, their fears, and their courage and feel what they felt when the 240mm howitzers shook history. History remembers machines, dates, and victories. But inside every great moment, there are people, ordinary men living through extraordinary events. When the 240mm howitzers arrived and began their thunder, the human world around them changed forever. To truly understand that day, we must step into the hearts of those who lived it. On the American side, the gun crews worked with calm focus. But inside their minds, emotions moved like hidden waves. Some felt pride, knowing they operated one of the most powerful guns ever built. Others felt fear. Fear of enemy fire, fear of making a mistake, fear of what awaited them after the first shell flew. Many were young. Some had joined the army only months earlier. They had trained hard, learned fast, and carried responsibilities bigger than their age. To them, the 240mm howitzer was both a tool and a burden. Its size brought power but also pressure. Every shot had to be perfect. Every decision mattered. A gunner named Michael, just 22 years old, once described the feeling. He said the gun felt alive, like it breathed with them. He remembered touching the cold steel barrel each morning, feeling the thin layer of dew on it, and whispering a quiet hope that it would protect his friends. He remembered the moments before firing when everyone held their breath at the same time. He remembered how silence broke into thunder again and again. To Michael, the gun was not just a machine. It was a promise. A promise that they could break the enemy walls, survive the day, and move one step closer to ending the war. Beside him was the loader, Thomas. Older, strong, quiet. He had the job of guiding each massive shell into place. Each time he lifted a shell, he felt its weight through his gloves. The shell shook slightly as he and two others pushed it into the chamber. He knew that inside that steel casing was enough explosive power to tear a fortress apart. He treated every shell with respect as if it were something sacred. Sometimes, late at night, he admitted to the younger soldiers that his hands still trembled from the shock waves long after the firing stopped. "The ground moves," he would say softly, and it keeps moving inside me even when everything is quiet. Then there was the officer, the one who gave the order to fire. A man who carried more than his own fear. He carried the weight of every man counting on him. He studied maps, checked the weather, calculated angles, and trusted that his decisions were right. When he raised his hand and said, "Ready," every soul around him felt the moment sharpen. When he said, "Fire," he sent thunder into the world. These men did not think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as workers doing a job too important to fail. They joked to calm their nerves. They shared stories about home. Some carried photographs of families in their pockets. Others carried good luck charms, a coin, a medal, a ribbon. But when the gun fired, all these small things vanished into the roar. Fear and courage mixed into one feeling. On the other side of the battlefield, inside the German fortresses, the emotional world was very different. Life inside those concrete walls had always been hard. The rooms were small. The air was dry and cold. The lights flickered slightly whenever machines started or stopped. Soldiers slept in narrow bunks stacked like shelves. They woke to the sound of boots on metal floors, the buzz of generators, and the rumble of ventilation fans. Many had been stationed there for months, some even years. They were used to feeling safe. Their commanders had told them again and again that the fortress walls could survive anything. They were told that even the strongest enemy shells would break before the concrete did. They were reminded that their fortresses were built with the knowledge of past wars, reinforced by new engineering techniques. So, at first, when the American howitzers began firing from far away, the soldiers inside the bunker felt calm. They heard distant rumbling. They felt small vibrations. But these things had happened before with smaller guns. They continued their work. Some cleaned their rifles. Others wrote letters. A few played cards in the dim light. But then came the first shell from the 240mm gun. It landed with a force they had never felt before. The impact echoed like an earthquake. Dust blew down from the ceiling. The walls trembled sharply. The tables moved. Cups fell off shelves. Lights dangled. The floor shook under their boots. For a moment, many soldiers froze, unable to understand what had happened. This was not normal artillery. This was something else. Something that could reach deeper, hit harder, and crack walls that were supposed to be unbreakable. Some soldiers tried to laugh it off, but the laughter was thin and nervous. Others checked the structural beams and listened carefully for cracking sounds. A few pressed their hands against the walls, feeling them tremble like a living creature struggling to stay still. When the second shell hit, the fear grew. The vibration traveled through the entire fortress. Papers fell from desks. Tools clattered in storage rooms. Concrete dust rose like smoke. Inside the communication room, officers tried to stay calm. They sent messages to nearby fortresses. They asked for information. They checked their maps. They told their men to hold position. But even they felt a tightness in their chest that they could not ignore. Some of the younger German soldiers began to whisper. "What kind of gun is that? Is the wall cracking? Will the ceiling hold? Why are the lights flickering?" Fear spreads quickly inside walls. A fortress is safe only when people believe it is safe. When doubt enters, the walls begin to feel smaller. The air grows heavier. Every sound becomes a threat. Then came the third shell. This one caused a deep cracking noise, like a giant splitting a stone with a hammer. The sound crawled down the tunnels. It echoed through hallways. It made soldiers look at each other with wide eyes. In one lower room, a group of German engineers rushed to inspect a section of wall. A thin line, just a hair's width, ran across the concrete surface. They touched it with their fingers. It felt warm. Concrete is not supposed to feel warm. That meant shock waves were traveling through it, heating it, weakening it. The engineers looked at each other and understood the truth. This was not a normal attack. This was a weapon designed to kill fortresses. While the walls shook, something else shook inside the soldiers. Belief. Belief that the fortress could protect them. Belief that the war would not reach them. Belief that their safety was stronger than enemy weapons. Fear replaced certainty. Above ground, American gunners continued their work. But they were not untouched by emotion. Every time the howitzer fired, the shockwave hit their bodies too. Their ears rang. Their eyes watered from the smoke. Their arms ached from managing the heavy shells. Their hearts beat hard. They smelled burning powder. They felt heat on their faces. They watched the distant fortresses slowly disappear behind clouds of dust. Some soldiers whispered, "Are they retreating?" Others wondered, "How many more shots until it collapses?" A few felt guilty thinking of the people inside being crushed by falling concrete. War gives no easy emotions. One American medic, standing behind the lines, felt his throat tighten each time the gun fired. He knew that inside those walls were men, scared and trapped. He also knew those fortresses had killed many Americans before. He understood the reason for the bombardment. But his heart still felt heavy. "We are breaking more than stone," he murmured quietly. Meanwhile, in a bunker corridor filled with dust, a German soldier named Rolf held his helmet tight as another shockwave shook the tunnel. His hands were trembling. His breath came fast. He looked at the thicker steel door ahead and whispered, "Please hold, please hold." Another soldier beside him covered his ears and squeezed his eyes shut. "I thought we were safe," he said. "They said nothing could break this place." Rolf didn't answer. He didn't know what to believe anymore. In another room, an older German officer tried to keep morale alive. He spoke calmly, telling his men that the walls were strong. But even he felt the truth sinking in. The fortress was no longer unbreakable. A giant gun, built across an ocean, pulled across ruined roads, assembled by tired soldiers, was tearing apart everything he believed in. Courage, fear, hope, pain, all lived together that day. The American gunners pushed forward with determination. The German defenders held on with fading belief. The landscape shook with every thunderous shot. And between both sides the human heart felt the full weight of war. As the bombardment continued, both sides learned something powerful. No matter how thick the walls, the human spirit is always thinner. No matter how strong the fortress, fear can slip through the cracks. No matter how loud the guns, the quiet thoughts inside a soldier's mind are louder. In that moment, the battlefield was not just a place of destruction. It was a place of truth. A place where people realized what it means to face something bigger than themselves. A place where courage was tested, where fear was felt, and where the future was being written by the shaking of the earth. This was not just the destruction of concrete. It was the collision of human emotions across two sides of a war. When the thunder of the 240mm howitzers slowly faded, when the smoke drifted into the sky and the ground stopped shaking, something larger than the battlefield remained behind. Something deeper than broken walls or cracked tunnels. Something that touched the meaning of human progress, human pride, and human limits. War has always carried one strange truth. Every time humans build something strong, someone else builds something stronger. Every time a wall rises, a weapon is created to bring it down. This cycle is as old as history itself. Spears against shields. Cannons against castles. Bombs against bunkers. And now, the 240mm howitzer against Germany's strongest fortresses. Why does this happen? Why does humanity keep building walls only to watch them fall? Perhaps the answer lies in the human heart. Humans seek safety. They seek control. They seek the feeling that they can protect what they love. A fortress, in many ways, is more than concrete. It is a dream that safety can be made solid, that danger can be shut out by walls. But danger always finds a way back in. Not because walls are weak, but because human innovation refuses to stop moving. We are always pushing, always reaching for something new, something more powerful. And so every wall becomes a temporary victory, every fortress a brief moment of confidence waiting to be tested. When the 240mm howitzers shattered those German fortresses, they did more than break concrete. They broke an idea, an old idea that had lived for centuries. The idea that a nation could build a perfect defense. The idea that any structure, no matter how thick or cleverly designed, could stand forever. In that moment, the world saw that safety cannot be built from stone alone. It must come from wisdom, understanding, and a willingness to shape the future instead of hiding from it. Think for a moment about the soldiers inside the fortresses that day. They were not weak. They were not untrained. They were not unprepared. They had placed their trust in something that had always worked before, walls. And then, in a single morning, they learned that trust can break as quickly as concrete. Fear teaches fast. But wisdom teaches deeper. Across the battlefield, the American soldiers learned something too. They learned that even the strongest enemy could be broken when people come together with skill, patience, and courage. They learned that the tools they operated could change the course of cities, strategies, even nations. And maybe, in the quiet moments after the bombardment, they also learned how heavy that responsibility feels. Because power is never simple. It always comes with weight. A weight that soldiers carry in silence. When the dust from the ruined fortresses settled, the silence felt heavy. The land seemed to breathe again. Birds slowly returned to the sky. Smoke rose in thin lines. And under that silence, a strange feeling grew, a feeling that something old had ended. An era. A belief. A tradition of war that had lasted for thousands of years. Fortresses had once protected kings, armies, and entire empires. They had stopped invaders. They had shaped borders. They had survived storms and sieges. They were symbols of pride and strength. But now, in a few hours of thunder, those ancient symbols had been proven fragile. This raises a simple but powerful question. If even stone can fall, what truly lasts? Not walls. Not machines. Not steel or concrete or tunnels. Maybe what lasts are the lessons we learn from their fall. The lesson that nothing is permanent. The lesson that strength is not found in what we build but in how we think. The lesson that fear and pride can blind us to change. The lesson that innovation will always move faster than tradition. Another question rises too. Do humans build fortresses to stop enemies, or to stop the future? The German commanders who trusted their fortresses were not foolish. They were holding on to something that had protected people for centuries. But the world was moving into a new age. An age when power came not from thick walls, but from ideas, engineering, and technology that could not be stopped by concrete. This is what the 240mm howitzers truly destroyed. Not just the fortresses, but the old belief that walls could hold back change. When the shells burst through the air, they carried with them a message, that the world had entered a new time, and that nations had to think differently, prepare differently, and understand that the future cannot be held back by stone. Think about the engineers who designed the howitzers. They did not set out to break history. They simply followed questions. Questions like, how can we make something stronger? Or what if the enemy builds something we cannot defeat? Their curiosity, their imagination, their problem-solving, these were the real forces that shattered the fortresses. Human progress is not loud like artillery. It begins quietly in workshops, in books, in small rooms where people think. But once it reaches the world, its impact can be louder than any explosion. The 240mm howitzer was the result of countless small thoughts. Ideas shaped into metal, metal shaped into power, power shaped into action. And on that battlefield, the world saw how ideas can break even the toughest walls. Yet even as technology grows stronger, the human heart remains fragile. The German soldiers felt that fragility as the walls shook around them. The American soldiers felt it as they fired the howitzer again and again. The officers on both sides felt it in the choices they had to make. Courage and fear lived together that day. And in the quiet after the thunder, a thought settled over the land. Maybe true strength is not about resisting change. Maybe true strength is understanding change, and learning from it. The broken fortresses became symbols of this truth. Their cracked walls, fallen ceilings, and silent halls remind us that nothing built by human hands lasts forever. Time changes everything. Innovation changes everything. And history moves forward whether we are ready or not. The lesson of that day echoes far beyond the battlefield. It speaks to every generation, every challenge, every moment when old ideas meet new realities. It tells us, if we rely only on what we built yesterday, we will be surprised by what arrives tomorrow. If we believe something is unbreakable, we stop thinking about how to improve it. If we trust walls too much, we forget to grow our minds. The fall of those German fortresses is now just a memory, a chapter in history books, a story told by veterans, a lesson taught to officers and engineers. But the meaning behind it continues to shape the world. Because the real human discovery that day was not the power of a gun. It was the deeper truth that strength does not come from walls. It comes from wisdom. from adaptability, from understanding that the world always moves forward. And those who move with it, those who learn, who imagine, who think, become the true builders of the future. The day the 240mm howitzers shattered Germany's strongest fortresses was the day humanity learned that the future cannot be stopped by stone. When the thunder faded and the dust settled back onto the quiet earth, the battlefield looked very different from the world that had existed only hours earlier. Broken concrete lay in jagged shapes across the ground. Deep cracks stretched along the sides of bunkers like veins on old stone. Smoke curled gently upward, mixing with the pale afternoon sky. The land, once full of echoes, finally became silent again. American soldiers lowered their tools. Their shoulders relaxed. Their hands, still warm from the vibration of the giant gun, slowly unclenched. Some stared at the distant ruins with quiet amazement. Others whispered to each other, unable to fully understand what they had just seen. They knew they had been part of something important, something that would be told and retold for years. On the other side, German soldiers stepped out from damaged bunkers with dust on their faces and disbelief in their eyes. Some walked slowly, touching the cracked walls, almost as if they expected them to heal. Others stood in silence, staring at the ground, wrestling with the shock of watching something they trusted collapse around them. In that moment, many understood that the war was changing faster than they had ever imagined. Above them all, the sky remained calm. The wind carried away the last traces of smoke. Birds slowly returned to the trees. Nature, always patient, began to reclaim the battlefield. And yet, the meaning of that day did not fade with the wind. The destruction of those fortresses was not just a military event. It was a turning point, one that showed the world that even the greatest defenses could be challenged, that the future could arrive in a single morning of thunder, and that human progress was stronger than concrete, thicker than walls, and faster than old beliefs. The 240mm howitzers fired only a few dozen shots that day. But the echo of those shots traveled far beyond the battlefield. It traveled into strategy rooms where generals began rethinking warfare. It traveled into classrooms where young engineers studied the limits of structures. It traveled into the minds of leaders, who realized that no barrier lasts forever. In the end, this story is not about a gun or a fortress. It is about the moment when two eras met, and only one continued forward. The day the 240mm howitzers arrived, they carried more than steel. They carried a message that still speaks to us today. Strength is not found in walls. Strength is found in learning, adapting, and moving with the world as it changes. And those who understand this truth shape the future. As the camera slowly pulls away from the silent ruins and the quiet fields, one thought remains. History is never still. It waits for no wall. It listens to no fortress. It moves forward, like thunder rolling across the sky, shaping the world one echo at a time.